Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Megan Ballesty. I'm a project coordinator at CIPPEC's Economic Development Program. And welcome everyone to the panel. This is called The Future of Work in the Global South, the Knowledge Narratives Policy Approach. A warm welcome as well to our distinguished panel. We have today Théophile Azomahou, Director of Training at the African Economic Research Consortium. We have Sabina Dewan, the President and Executive Director at JustJobs Network. And we have Ramiro Albrieu, Principal Investigator at CIPPEC and Project Leader for the Future of Work in the Global South initiative. Big thanks as well to GDN for inviting us to participate in this year's edition of Evidence for Development. For me, it's an honor to be hosting this panel and have the opportunity to engage in a dialogue with such an interesting panel. This panel actually happens also to represent a partnership that has been working together for the past year already, and it covers the 4 Global South regions of Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the partnership also includes the Middle East and North Africa. So I think it's really exciting to have 3 of the 4 Global South regions and such a good geographical representation of the developing world today. So before turning to the panelists and asking the first question, I wanted to take a few minutes to let you know a bit more about this partnership on the future of work with Global South perspectives. So to frame the discussion and the panel today, 2 statements. First, the fact that 85% of the global labor force lives in the Global South. So in a way, if we are allowed to bring in the demography factor into the discussion, into the equation, we can say that the future of work will actually take place in the Global South. At the same time, on the other hand, the future of work as a field of research is still mostly about the developed world. And this is not just because developed countries produce more research, which they do, but also because of the nature of this field of research itself, because it's so new and because it's about understanding the impact of advanced technological change. And this is because this is something that is largely happening in developed economies. Then the discussion is many times framed about what's relevant for economies where this is already taking place. And in the meantime, developing countries are still struggling to accelerate their processes of technological transformation. So sometimes it ends happening that the research questions that are relevant to countries that are undergoing already steep processes of technological transformation just cannot be taken at face value and replicated in the developing world just because the same questions might not make the sense in the same way. So there is this sort of mismatch between the challenges represented many times in the literature of the future of work and the challenges facing most of the workers globally who live in the Global South. So to give a quick example about this, you have already probably heard about the indicators that measure the risk of automation of jobs and how the literature warns about higher risks of automation in developing countries. But at the same time, what these indicators measure is actually the technological feasibility of automating certain tasks, right? So using the most advanced technologies available, which tasks could potentially be replaced by a technological solution. But the thing is that the rates of technological change that would be required for this risk of automation to actually materialize in developing countries is far higher than we are managing to achieve in these countries. And the conditions to promote technological change are also quite weak. So I guess the question is, if it's enough in the Global South to measure technological feasibility as a way to approximate the risk of automation, or otherwise, what are the other factors that are relevant to determine the actual risk of automation? And most importantly, what are other research questions that might be more urgent in places where technological change cannot be taken for granted, right? So with this goal in mind of contextualizing research and asking the right research question, is that this partnership is exploring innovative approaches to knowledge brokering, like collective intelligence, like narrative building, and using them as tools that are useful at the time of thinking about research questions, designing research projects, and so on. Just one small remark on narratives, which is part of today's discussion. Narratives is a concept that's widespread now, and we hear a lot about them, and it can be understood in different ways. But economist and Nobel laureate Robert Shiller defined narratives as representations of reality used to give an explanatory account of a society period. So as a way to interpret and make sense of complex social issues and still be able to tell this and convey this in a story. And narratives, when evidence-based, when context-based and adapted to the context of the issue of study, are key tools for research because they allow both to frame research problems at the design phase and also to convey research findings and convey them as part of a wider phenomenon than just pieces of information. So when it comes to the future of work field of research, because it's such a new topic of research, we do already have a sort of dominating narrative that has been consolidating in the past few years, but we see that it still lacks context from the developing countries. So that is what this partnership has been working on for the past few years, on building Global South regional narratives to make sense of the phenomenon, to give context to the future of work issue. And well, apologies for the long introduction. Now I think that we are ready to move forward to the first question to the panelists. And it's exactly about this, about the standard narrative on the future of work that we are familiar with. And I'd like to start with Ramiro and ask you, if based on your research and based on your knowledge, what is this standard narrative on the future of work missing about the Global South, and more specifically about the Latin American context?
Well, hi everyone, and thanks for the invitation. First, I think that I'm not sure if there's something missing in a way, because we talk about skills, about technology, about regulations, about demographics, and every dimension that has to do with the future of work. You can see that in the global literature, but I'm thinking about more about the weights of how to engage, how to try to learn about these dimensions. So I think that they are in analyzing technology, in the way you analyze skills, in the way you approach to demography, you can find these differences. Maybe there's not some single element that is missing, because as in Tolstoy's phrase, right? Every poor family is poor in some way. And it's the same with developing countries, right? We have different problems, we have different obstacles. But what I'm saying is that I think that what we need is different ways to approach to these broad topics. And let me give you just one example about that has to do with demographics. I mean, we are when we start reading the papers, the flagship reports about the future of work, we talked a lot about the problem with the pension system, about UBI as a future network or safety net, for a world without work, without job positions. And when I read that, I think that we are talking about old age societies where these problems are more pressing. But when you move to the developing world, you will see countries going through the demographic dividend, or even younger countries, such as many of the countries in Africa. So when you take the demographics or the demography dimension, thinking about population structure, you will get different stories, different challenges. For example, for many countries in Asia, like middle-income countries in Asia and in Latin America, maybe the problem is more about productivity. You know, how can we find a source of long-term growth when we will be older and older and we will lose working age population in the future? Maybe for younger countries, going or entering into the demographic dividend, the more pressing issue is not a safety net, but creating jobs. Maybe job creation is, the big challenge. And maybe for even younger countries, such as many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and many also in Latin America, poorer, smaller countries, maybe the issue is more about the quality quantity trade-off in investing in education, in human capital, So what I'm saying is that it's okay to bring demographics into the picture, but we need to ask first, where are we as the developing world in the stage of the demographic transition? Because if I am part of, I don't know, Bolivia, for example, I need to think about how I'm going to invest in human capital, because that's key, because they have a lot of children as a share of population, So I'm more thinking not about a big dimension that is missing, but go into these dimensions and try to bring a global South perspective to assess what the challenges are and will be in the near future. So again, as in demographics, you can see this, this bias toward aging societies lens to analyze the future of work. I think that you can find quite the same thing for technological change, for skills, and so on. So just to wrap up, to summarize, again, I think that the topics are okay in a way as broad topics, but I think that we need to work harder on trying to not to buy the global north agenda on these topics as our problems.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ramiro. I think you brought up very relevant examples that should be also considered when thinking about the future of work from the developing country perspectives. Thank you for that. Théophile, may I ask you the same question? Is there something missing from the current understanding that we have on the future of work from a more standard point of view? And is there something that we need to consider to better understand the Sub-Saharan African perspective?
So thank you, Megan, for your invitation to join this panel. And good, here it is the afternoon, so I would say maybe good morning or afternoon to Ramiro and Sabina. It's really nice to join you. Well, like Ramiro just mentioned, I'm not seeing something which is missing and which is of major concern. However, there are some, specificities of the Sub-Saharan African region, and that matters for the debates. And I think it's mainly about, narrative, as you mentioned. And narrative means, contextualize the way things are formulated. As you know, the fourth industrial revolution is characterized by significant breakthroughs on the technology fronts, and being artificial intelligence, machine learning, or robotics. And this revolution has also resulted in a huge shift to online daily activities by various stakeholders, which has in turn, I think, led to new ways of looking at work and a rethink of the traditional approaches to education and training. And this is one of the main concerns for AERC, as you know. And unfortunately, these breakthroughs come with the risk of some population being left behind. And as the collaboration between AERC and CIPPEC is progressing, some regional development agencies like the African Development Bank have also produced insightful reports on the future of work in the regions. I mean, in sub-Saharan Africa. There is a little doubt that the efficacy of these technologies depend on a kind of convoluted mix of economic, social, institutional, and international factors. Considering potential regional differences in these factors, it makes sense to take a closer look at the impact of these technologies on the sub-Saharan African region. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic has also accelerated the rate of change that characterized the fourth industrial revolution, and the loss of millions of jobs in sub-Saharan Africa owing to the COVID-19 pandemic has brought in new dimensions that ought to be considered in the discussion of the future of work in the region. And the main challenge pertains to what to do in post-COVID by the way of inclusive and sustainable job creation. Will the emergence of new technologies help or hurt sub-Saharan Africa on the job front and other fronts, considering both its benefits and the potential for economic, social, and political disruption? So also, is there a technological divide? Okay, are there feasible solutions to precarious working conditions associated with the rapidly expanding big economies? So will new technologies lead to more secure or higher earning in informal employment or faster formal sector job growth? These are concerns for sub-Saharan Africa, and also the regions, like other regions, is not, shielded from the positive and negative impact of technological innovation on the future of work. Some have, noted that sub-Saharan Africa is in an advantageous, position with respect to the adoption of new technologies, given its growing young population who are potentially more amenable to change. So it has also been noted that sub-Saharan African countries and other less developed countries have an advantage, of developing late, thereby giving, them the option of simply borrowing, the technology without having to incur, exorbitant innovation costs. So at the same time, I think Africa is behind the developed world in many areas, as far as usage is concerned, and owing to a kind of convoluted mix of country-specific factors that can limit the transformation from access to use. So several other aspects of the sub-Saharan African situation are particularly, noteworthy. First, certain technological innovations have worked in certain countries, like the digital financial system in East Africa. Second, Africa is still behind with respect to adoption, but should not, and cannot fall behind. And third, the digital divide is by gender, age, region, and disability status, among others. So this being said, there are several other, aspects of the impact of technology on the future of work in sub-Saharan Africa that deserve attention for better understanding, to, devise better policies that can pull the sub-Saharan African countries out of the current problem. So let me stop there, just to wrap up. So the narrative, the context matters. For me, that's the most important things.
Thank you, Theo. Thank you for contextualizing that, and for bringing the important issue of having a systemic view of this topic. I think that's very important. So let's move on to asking the same question to Sabina. What is missing in the standard account of the future of work to better represent Asian opportunities and challenges when it comes to the future of work?
Great. Thank you so much, Megan, for the introduction and for the question, and also for the invitation to be here. The disadvantage of coming after my fellow speakers, my fellow panelists, is that they've already added tremendous amounts of insights to the conversation, which I fully agree with, both Ramiro and Théophile. I think what I would say is just maybe building a little bit more on what's already said is that, and this is also where you started, Megan, that broadly the discourse around technology, it doesn't fully appreciate the realities of the global South, and this is also driven by a number of factors, like a lack of data, probably the lack of actually hard data being the biggest reason for why some of these narratives are more driven by the global North realities than the South. But then I ask, okay, why do we not have as much data from the global South? And the big question, the big issue here is that the labor markets in the global South are fundamentally more heterogeneous. And here I'm talking about low income and low middle income countries that fundamentally have more heterogeneous labor markets than those in the global South. And what that means is that when you have different kinds of technological developments, we can talk about robotization and how it affects manufacturing jobs. We can talk about platformization, and even platformization has multiple strands, right? Platformization could be e-commerce jobs, or it could be gig work, which is location or cloud-based, and so both automation and digitalization will have differential impacts on different segments of a very heterogeneous labor market to begin with. And what ends up happening is that it becomes really complicated to understand not just how technology and digitalization will impact the quantity and quality of work in a particular sector, but we have to ask, what kind of digitalization are we talking about? And we have to ask about what kind of movements are there, right? Different groups of people are moving now. Also with the pandemic, as Theo said, there was an acceleration of technological advancement with the pandemic, which is expediting a lot of the changes that we were already experiencing. So, how is technology restructuring labor markets, and how are people moving from the formal to the informal, for example? So understanding the movement of people, and all of this is very complicated in developing countries, precisely because of the heterogeneous labor markets. So that's point number one that I wanted to make. The second thing I wanted to just contribute was, I want to give you a very concrete example of an area where certainly I think the international discourse on the future of work and the nexus with technology has touched upon formality and informality. But let's take an example of what we mean by informality in the context of a developing country, right? There's different dimensions to it. The first is, we're talking about informality with regards to enterprises. And what enterprises are informal enterprises are those that are unregistered, right? And what technological advancement means for them. Do you get small businesses that don't have access to technology? Do you get them access to technology, and how do you do that? How does it affect their business? Does it lead to more employment? So there's a whole set of issues there around enterprises. The other aspect of informality is informal employment, which is linked to the worker, right? And it refers to, generally, by and large, to workers that don't have access to benefits, that are beyond the purview of labor regulations. And what does it mean for them, right? And part of this informal employment also refers to those people that are self-employed, who have their own responsibility to access Social Security and other welfare benefits, right? They also fall within this category of informal employment. So I'm just giving you an example of the different kinds of enterprises, different kinds of workers by labor status, and how the technology question, the impact of what technology is doing to each of them in their livelihoods, in their existence, in their contributions to employment, it has to be looked at through a very nuanced lens and a nuanced understanding of this particular phenomenon that we call informality, right? So, when you hear the broad discourse, people will say, oh, we want to formalize the informal. Okay, but what does that mean, right? How do you leverage technology to formalize the informal? Are you talking about getting companies, small businesses registered and therefore somehow formalizing them? Or are you talking about instituting some kind of a broad social safety net that will all of a sudden cover, universal safety net that now covers all your informal employment with benefits, and therefore you get rid of informal employment per se, right? Like, what is it that we're talking about? And, I've been working on these issues, as Ramiro and Theo presumably have, for years, right? 20 years I've been in this business, and we are still confused. In the discourse, nobody gets down to the details of these issues, but that is where the rubber meets the road. And if we really want to think about and plan for the future of work, we need to actually take, to use a cliche, a bottom-up approach to understand the heterogeneity in the way that labor markets work in the global South, and then assess the impact that technology, the differential impact that technology will have in each of these segments, and then think about, okay, how do we manage this impact so that we can leverage the benefits that technology has to offer and minimize the costs. But I just wanted to give you a very specific example of how I think the international debate could be much more nuanced and what's missing from that debate.
Great, thank you very much for that, Sabina. Thanks also for bringing in the issue about data, which of course is key, but also heterogeneity, which we'll be discussing in the next round as well, because it appears all over the developing countries, and it's true that sometimes terms or the challenge of forming narratives when there's so much heterogeneity and need for nuance becomes more challenging, and some terms are too broad. Thank you for that. By the way, I know that Yasmin from ERF is around. So Yasmin, if you want to join the panel, you need to click the share audio and video button. But let's move on with the second round of questions. And I understand, I know that this partnership has been working in the last couple of months also in a sort of collective intelligence exercise that was replicated in each of the Global South regions, where you invited groups of experts to discuss from different areas to discuss the future of work with context for each of your regions in a sort of taking stock exercise, which is also, of course, very important to develop this holistic and contextualizing understanding that we are trying to develop. So I'd like to focus a bit more on these more specific findings that you had from this exercise. So if I may start with you, Sabina, this time. I think that all of you discussed the topic of labor platforms and the gig economy in these workshops. And in particular in Asia, however, there is this growth model, service-led growth model that is becoming more widespread among some of the Asian countries. So I wonder if as this sector services become more competitive and more important, the gig economy is becoming more relevant in this region or not, and what challenges and what opportunities does the gig economy and the platformization of work bring for Asia? And if I may, if this has changed with the pandemic. Sorry for the long question, Sabina.
No, that's an excellent question, Megan. Thank you. I think there's two components to your question. The first component is the issue of sort of a more macro issue of whether technology, and Ramiro had brought this up, how technology is affecting productivity and whether this isn't somehow leading to what economists call a structural transformation in the economy, right? So in the very broadest sense, and I'm talking at the 10,000 foot level here, we've got three sectors. We've got, agriculture, we've got industry, including manufacturing, and then we've got services. And the conventional wisdom is that the agricultural sector, which a number of developing countries continue to rely on in Africa and Asia and so on, that this is largely work that is less productive. And so as workers move out of agriculture into either manufacturing or service-led economies, in an economy, as they move out of agriculture into manufacturing or services, that this is somehow a structural transformation, because presumably manufacturing and services are much more productive work. Now, I'd like to question that notion. Simply because if you actually, and I'm really talking at a 10,000 foot level here, and there's much more nuance that can be added to this conversation, but at a 10,000 foot level, we've seen both in certain countries in Africa, I'll use Rwanda just as a comparative example, and India, we've actually seen that there has been movement out of agriculture into services. But what has happened is that there's been, in India, for example, there's been much more movement of people, but very little associated rise in productivity, right? So if you look at the value add, there's been very little additional value added by the service sector, but you've seen a lot of people leave agriculture and move to services. And I think there's been a similar trend in Rwanda where people have left agriculture and are moving into services, but it hasn't been this associated value add growth in the service sector. What does that mean? You have more people doing the same kind of work, the same work. Work is distributed across more people, which means that per person productivity is lower, right? And this connects to the rise of the gig economy, because what is happening is that a lot of countries still are working from the conventional development wisdom that just moving people out of agriculture into services or manufacturing is a structural transformation. I would actually argue that many countries are not seeing a transformation. What they're seeing is structural change, but not transformation, right? That we're changing the structure of economies. Maybe agriculture is actually shedding some jobs, and these people are moving into services, but they're not necessarily moving into jobs that are high productivity jobs. And therefore, we have to question the entire wisdom behind, or knee-jerk wisdom behind service sector equals growth, higher productive jobs and growth trajectories. That's not necessarily true. Let me give you one more quick example on that. If we look at in India in the 2000s, everyone's heard of the growth of the business process outsourcing in India, and how we had the Bangalore was the Silicon Valley of India, where we sort of leveraged these call centers to really fuel service-led growth. Now if you look at what's happening with the kinds of technologies of the fourth industrial revolution that we have today, you basically have automated much of that work now, right? So you call into some kind of call center, and the first 60%, 70% of that conversation is press this number, press that number, and it takes you through a number of automated menus before you hit a person at the very end. What this means is that the employment impact in a service-led model today is very different than what it was even in the 2000s for India at that time, where we actually leveraged call centers in order to create more jobs, right? We're having a lot less jobs impact. So now there's two things. There's quantity of jobs, and there's the productivity associated with jobs, and questioning the conventional wisdom that service-led growth is automatically high productive jobs, and how those interact with each other. Gig economy, I'll just say 2 points and then I'll stop talking. But there's questions around the gig economy because essentially the gig economy in and of itself is very diverse, right? You have some online, you have the online and location-based, and some online work. You have freelancing, which is very high skilled. You have microtasking, which is less skilled. Then you have on-location work that ranges from, you know, in-home beauty services to carpentry to your cab drivers, right? So it's a very heterogeneous space to begin with. But the fundamental point about the gig economy is this. One, that it is a sector that has very low barriers to entry. So people moving out of other jobs, you mentioned the pandemic, as the pandemic has destroyed small businesses and employment in other sectors, we're definitely seeing, you know, an uptick in gig work. But gig work has very low barriers to entry, and this is somewhat disconnected to the demand, right? So I might all of a sudden see a complete rise in India. We have Swiggy, which is a meal delivery service, or, you know, Zomato, which is a meal delivery, you know, concierge service. So I might see a rise in the number of people that are in that job, but that doesn't mean that that's necessarily corresponding to as much demand or as quickly, right? Which means that gig economy work has a range, but there's the low barrier parts of the gig economy are actually experiencing an excess amount of labor supply. And when you have more workers than demand, this depresses wages and working conditions, right? So, and this is all being fueled now even more by the pandemic, because there's fewer other jobs. Gig economy has less barriers, more people entering, which means now all of a sudden, in terms of the delivery services, there's so many workers in that sector that, you know, the platforms can keep their rates low, can, you know, play around with working conditions, and that puts downward pressure. And these are the low-end service sector jobs that are absorbing more people, but aren't having the big bang for the buck in terms of value add to the overall economic development model. So I'll just stop there, but thanks.
Well, thank you. Thank you. You've given us a very good sense of the challenges of these service-led growth models and of the gig economy. Thank you. Théophile, moving to Sub-Saharan Africa and demography, which you and Ramiro touched upon in the previous section. Demography is important when thinking about the future of work in general, and in particular in Sub-Saharan Africa. So what challenges does the current demographic stage bring to the region, and how is this interacting with technological change?
Megan, you see, there is something in the demography in Sub-Saharan Africa which is really critical. I would say even becoming an issue, and which is the youth bulge, you know. And, you know, the main feature of a demographic transition is, I would say, a combination of improved human capital development, chiefly healthcare services, education, sanitation, gender equality, and other factors to reduce mortality, and concurrently a lowering of fertility rates. And this trajectory is meant to bring about demographic dividends and featuring improved per capita resources, reduce youth dependency ratio, increase urbanization and industrialization, as well as improve GDP per capita in countries. And as a result, demographic transition should bring dividends, okay? That's the ideal, you know, framework. And however, the demographic narrative in Sub-Saharan Africa is different. And the demography and the labor market in Africa show some specific characteristics. The population council, you know, 2020 indicates that the population of Africa is expected to double from 1.2 billion in 2020 to 2.4 billion in 2050. And the projection by the United Nations in 2015 is that the proportion of under 25 population in Africa is expected to exceed 60% by the year 2030. So the demographic transition in Africa is seen as clearly a different trajectory than expected in the traditional, framework. Most African countries appear to be stuck in what we call the phase 2 of the transition, with consequences for, a burgeoning, youth population in what is termed the youth bulge. These unique characteristics has put African countries in a kind of precarious position that of an extremely large youth population in comparison to the other population, groups. So in the demographic transition concept, this bulge made up of the productive age group should drive the process of bringing about the demographic dividends by providing the productive workforce, right, that will drive the economy. However, it appears that the labor markets and indeed the resource frontier is not large enough to accommodate them in Africa, and more specifically in Sub-Saharan Africa. While the supply of labor continues to increase, the capacity of Africa's labor market to absorb this labor force is weak. And the dividend expected of a demographic transition has therefore eluded many African economies, since available resources have been grossly insufficient, to absorb the timing, youth population in a very efficient way. So the challenge of demography and a productive labor market is therefore not only a problem of the excess supply of labor, rather the absorptive capacity of the labor market in Africa appears too weak to live up, to expectations. So about, 10 to 12 billion people enter the labor market on an annual basis, and to meet a labor space of 3.2, million of people in Africa, and this is really tough. So again, the African labor market is mainly informal in nature, labor intensive and low paying, with low prospects for a sustained job life, and consequently situations, of underemployment thrive on the continent. So the underemployment phenomenon is on the rise, with an increase in the number of educated youth. And there is a shift in the type of job requirements, with sharp moves away from the informal sector to more formal. And, Sabina is saying this, should we formalize the informal sector? This is a very important question. So also, young women and girls are even more vulnerable, with lower educational outcome and access to reproductive agency, leading to a vicious cycle of poverty, low age at first birth, lower educational attainment, and negative employment outcomes. So the above narrative therefore calls for a kind of, I would say, compendium of policies and action points. And the question is, how can we mitigate the effect of the youth bulge? On the supply side, there is, an imperative to modify the educational system to upgrade skills to match work requirements in the future of works. This entails appropriate schooling and training, and it is a whole, gamut that begins with the early childhood, education up till the tertiary education. School curriculum must be flexible and subject to innovation and, at almost instant basis, I would say. So on the supply side is also the need to cope with and mitigate against the impact of the youth birth. So on the one hand, there are several family planning interventions that limit the fertility rates and eventually lead to an optimal level of fertility that correspond to the available resources. Closely related, I would say, to the issue of fertility decline is the need
I think we lost Théophile. But let's wait for him to
has, far-reaching effects on the demographic transition process and its anticipated dividends. So when women and girls have opportunities, to be educated and, gainfully employed, the likelihood for them to improve educational outcome of the offspring is much higher. So those policies, prescription to combat, the consequences of youth birth involves improving, job readiness through schooling and training, creating jobs, and acting an active industrial policy and family planning intervention. So there are also policies from the demand side, targeting both private and public sector, and also some institutional factors that we need to take into account. Megan.
Thank you, Théophile. Yes, I think you characterized the challenges of the youth bulge very clearly for us. Thank you for that. And then moving forward with Ramiro and the case of Latin America, this is a region that's also characterized by structural inequality and a lot of heterogeneity in markets. So what does this fragmentation imply when you take a forward-looking view on labor markets? What I mean is, starting from such diverging paths, can we aim for some sort of convergence, or how do you think that divergence will play out?
Thanks, Megan. First, I will just, if I may, I will react to my colleagues here, because that's what's wonderful of thinking together. Then I will go Latin American, I promise. I will say hola and so on. But now, just let me react to that. I think that when I was hearing both of you, I was thinking about Arthur Lewis, framework for understanding duality, economic duality, because in a way, we have these labor markets. We have some part of the labor market that is well connected, well informed, has the capabilities to understand global ideas and so on. And then we have people that are entering into a labor force that they just are trying to find something, to live with. I mean, some salary, some money for the day, and maybe this second labor market is not guided by labor demand, by future technologies, by future prospects of anything. So sometimes I think that we are struggling to apply our framework for formal, I will say dynamic, well-connected labor markets in the global south to this. I will with that's if they are markets. I'm not sure if they are markets or not. So I think that we need to have a battle also over concepts, over informality, over markets, because when you use one concept, you just go to a framework, and maybe we are going the wrong way, So I was thinking about Arthur Lewis and this idea of this excess supply in low skill I will say market, sorry, labor market as a deep force, that is creating these breaches. I also like this idea of like bad structural change, instead of telling the story of from agriculture to manufacturing to services. No, maybe it can go wrong, because technology is not something in a vacuum. It's techne, it's a way of doing things. So it's embedded in our capabilities, our infrastructure, our social norms, and so on. So I really like that. So now I go Latin American. Hola todos. So I think that in our case in Latin America, we are always struggling with fragmentation and with inequality, but not only inequality as in the Gini, as in income or in wage income. I'm saying structural inequality. I'm saying that we have, again, if you look at the productive sector, the firms, you have these very dynamic firms that are exporting, that are part of global value chains, that are engaging in technological transformation regarding to advanced technologies, AI, cloud computing, machine learning for, predictive maintenance of stocks, whatever. And then you have like a missing middle of firms. And then you have all the other SMEs, firms that working on the non-tradable sectors, selling just whatever it takes, for survival. So if you look at the firms, you can find like a low productivity on average, but average doesn't mean anything in Latin America, because you have these two different stories, two different narratives, two different futures also, if you just let them interact, two different futures. So it is quite the same in the if you go to workers' capabilities. You have these, I don't know, 20% of workers in Latin America that are ready to embrace new ideas, ready to go for AI solutions in their workplace. And then you have the other part of labor market that are just trying to get a cell phone. They're struggling to enter into the third industrial revolution, trying to understand ICTs. And so we have this combination of different generations of technologies in firms and in workers, and then you have inequality also embedded in public policy. I mean, we have, for example, the educational system in Latin America. The public education in Latin America is creating knowledge for the rich. I mean, maybe Argentina is different, but if you look at Colombia, Costa Rica, even Brazil, you will see that the poor people is paying taxes for the food that they consume, and this money is going to, the upper middle income or even the rich people who are putting their kids in public schools. It's the same with the pension system, where we are, creating safety nets for the rich and for the upper middle of our society. So in a way, we have these big elites that were rich and are rich, and they are biasing policies toward their own benefit. I'm saying I'm part of this elite. I'm not saying that. We are doing that. We are asking for more subsidies for consuming energy, for my swimming pool, while poor people are struggling to find something to be part of some safety net. So what I'm saying is that structural inequality in my region is well beyond GDP, is well beyond SMEs against big firms. I mean, it's embedded in every social interaction and even in public policy. So it's really hard to break, these differences, these divides, because they are everywhere. And our governments are not putting in place policies to solve, to close this device. but in a way they are amplifying this device. So again, I think that when I try to understand the future of work in Latin America, what I see is different futures of work for different parts of our societies. So we are an already fragmented society, and I see more fragmentation in the future. Of course, the global north is going to more fragmentation. That's why you can read books on the US labor market using the Arthur Lewis framework, just to understand this missing middle. But what I'm saying is that maybe you are not going to catch up with us, because we are moving towards more fragmentations if we don't change policies. But if we don't include structural inequality by design when you think about policies. So again, I think that I applaud the idea of trying to understand inequality. I really like Piketty's and their team effort to measure wealth inequality. And I think that we need to go a little further to combine this that has to do with the private sector with inequality within public policies. In our cases, the Gini is not changing that much if you take market income as post tax income or post fiscal policy income. So what I'm saying is, here you can find that for me at least a sign of a warning sign of that we are not doing enough to change this story. So in a way we will have again futures of work to take into account in 30 years or 20 years in the future.
Thank you very much, Ramiro, also for your reactions to the other panelists' comments. I think that yes, challenging and complementing existing frameworks and even concept is very aligned to this broader objective and goal that you share of building more contextualized narratives and understandings for future work. Also, for summarizing that averages don't explain much in Latin America as well as in other regions, and for that call to action. So before our final round of questions, let me tell the audience that you can leave any questions that for the panelists in the questions box, and we'll try to address them after the last question. And now let's discuss a policy for a bit. You mentioned a number of challenges before. So the question for all of you would be, what can policymakers do to address these challenges? It's a very broad question, but if you had just 5 minutes to convince a policymaker to take action, what would you recommend? And I'm sure you are going to touch upon skills because you already did in many cases. So let me add a question from the audience about how educations and skills, whether they are realigning in these regions and countries to represent better the position of students to be able to function in the future labor markets. So what can policy do to address these challenges? Théophile, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you, Megan, for this. It is a terrible question. I am a researcher, right? And, I would prefer not to be on the policymaker side, because the goal is terrible for them. What we can do is to provide some, path, some thinking how we think things can be. But when it comes, to take the decision and to apply this for population, it's quite tough. So there are several, possible ways, in which the future of work in the global south will become sustainable and able to absorb the timing labor supply. This can be viewed from, the development of skills at the early childhood stages to strengthening the demographic transition process and reducing the inequality in the labor market, as Ramiro just mentioned. And let me just highlight 4 policy avenues. The first I will say is skill development, and skills development includes, among other, early childhood and formal education, the development of functional career center in educational institutions, and also, vocational training. Concerning, early childhood and formal education, closing the digital gap and improving the future of work in Africa will require improving the composition and quality of, human capital in a manner that the core skills to match work requirements, and develop not just for the present day, but for the possible work disruptions that may emerge in the future. And the second thing I would like to mention is the big economy and labor market institutions. The big economy is growing fast in Sub-Saharan Africa, but its regulation poses, a challenge in the absence of formal employer-employee relationship. And several policies can be highlighted. An active intervention of government is needed, for an appropriate regulatory framework, but it will also require a kind of dialogue with both members of associations representing big workers and the employers. It is also, I think, imperative that Sub-Saharan African government re-examine the issue surrounding informality, as Sabina mentioned at the beginning. This is crucial for them, and most importantly, recognize the need for the coexistence of the formal and informal worker sector. Shall we formalize the informal economy? I don't think so. This is a huge debate. When you put this in front of a policymakers, they need, to more revenue, and for that, they wanted to formalize the informal sector. I'm not sure that that's the best way to go, but this needs a very specific debate. What is informality in Africa, in the African context? Okay, this is something else. The third thing I wanted to highlight is the demography and labor market. We need an institutional framework to meeting the job needs. The digitalization of the African workforce and the mitigation of the effects of the youth bulge is, as I previously mentioned, I won't, go back to this. I already mentioned the policy aspect of the demographic transition in Africa. The fourth aspect I wanted to highlight is closing the digital divide. What are the strategies and the intervention? So closing the digital divide is perhaps, I think, the most important process that must be, put in place within the African workspace. It is not a disjointed process of single strategies, but a concise, concerted effort to include an area of solutions, increase digital literacy, inclusive policy in education and skills acquisition, and also data and monitoring systems. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Théophile. Ramiro, and also, Ramiro, let me add this question from you in our chat box, where they highlight that you speak about deep inequalities. So perhaps you could also provide 2 or 3 policies that you can think can change this imbalance in developing countries as well.
Yes, thanks for this, India Bharat. I didn't know that. I mean, we use this all in Latin America, this view of Brazil as a mix between Belgium and India, called Belindia. But I never heard about India and Bharat, so thanks for that, Madhuri. Yes, I think that it's important to understand first that technology is biased towards those with that can pay for it, right? With wealth, with skills, with a louder voice. So that's how technology is being created for those who are in the market, who can pay. So the question is, how can we think of technological change for those who cannot pay for technology? You know, for those who are not thinking as consumers by these firms. You know, so I think that public policies can work on trying to translate all that we know about new technologies into solutions for those who are not part of the market for technology. You know, they are not being analyzed by anthropology inside big firms that try to find a way of creating new technologies. So I think that public policies has a key role to play in translating, in choosing technologies for adapting these solutions to solve the problems for those who has no voice or who are not part of the technology market. But the problem in Latin America and maybe in India as well, as I'm reading here for Maduri, is that institutions are also biased towards those wealthier with a louder voice. So it's not that we have policies that counteract, you know, that can balance this force of markets going for trying to convince the rich. Maybe the problem in our country is that policies are also trying to convince the rich, you know. So instead of balancing, you know, this market power. So I think that it's really hard to solve this problem. Maybe we can think of policies that can balance this market power. For example, I was thinking about when I was hearing Théophile, I was thinking about this vocational training in Latin America. I mean, we have a lot of these experiences in the private sector and in the public sector, but they are all for the formal workers. They are basically for men. They are for they are in inside like big firms and not for SMEs. So in a way, all these institutions again are biased towards those who are previously in the better position to be part of the digital transformation. So in a way, I think that we need to think differently. We need to think about the economic margins, you know. So I think that governments can engage with the private sector, with the tech sector in a new bargain, you know, in a new contract, a new social contract, you know, trying to translate technologies for finding these solutions. I mean, we have examples of how to provide, for example, Wi-Fi in shanty towns by using cloud computing and part of edge computing in many of our countries in Latin America. For example, there you can have an example. I think that governments can embrace e-learning, for example, in some environments, and I think that can change the situation or can make technology more usable in these conditions. So I think that you can find these use cases for policy that are important, but again, I think that first you need the policy institutions to think differently, to change the way they see technology, to be able to choose, you know, to have a choice on technologies. And I think that we are not in this stage yet, you know. Also, we need governments that can fail, that can innovate and fail, you know, regarding using technologies, regarding providing skills, development solutions. So again, I think that there's a lot to do, there's a lot to learn, but there are also some examples that we can take and we can try to apply to the other countries.
Thank you, Ramiro, for sharing those very important key policy recommendations. And Sabina, the same question for you regarding policy priorities, but let me also add this question by the audience. because when you mentioned structural change and how it doesn't necessarily mean transformation, in the audience, Arjan from Ottawa is asking if there is a gender dimension to this. So if you have time to comment on this too.
Sure, absolutely. So I think let me start with answering the question about structural change and whether there's a gender dimension. I think that there definitely is a gender dimension. It has to be investigated a little bit more, I think, to delineate the data better. I mean, as I said, data is so weak, and sometimes we're pushed into like looking at macro data, but I think there is an opportunity to investigate and collect empirical data to substantiate the exact impact in terms of differential impact in terms of gender. But let me tell you why I said, yes, there is a gender dimension and what I'm basing that on, if not hard data that's available. We know, for example, from the data that is available, that women are often relegated to the low productivity kinds of jobs, right? So we know, for example, that COVID has also had a disproportionate adverse impact on women in terms of dislocating them. This is well substantiated across a number of studies. And so therefore, I think it's not too far a leap to imagine that if some of the structural change is happening out of agriculture into services, that is also, and we know that women are disproportionately employed in agriculture, right? Low productivity jobs in agriculture. So it's not too far-fetched to imagine that some of the structural change without transformation is also women, and not just men. And then, of course, we have to dig a lot deeper and see exactly how some of this structural change is affecting women, what that journey looks like, how many, all of those details still need to be filled out. But we know that there's also women also tend to be, so if we look at the ecosystem of women's employment, they tend to be in low productivity jobs. So there's also that particular angle. So I know that's not very specific, but that's also because that kind of disaggregated data, hard data, isn't available. But there are starting points that we can use as hypotheses to further investigate the impact of the structural change on women. So now I hope I've answered your question, Ariane. Now going on to the question about policy recommendations. So again, I think it's wonderful to hear Ramiro and Théophile speak, because I feel like clearly throughout this collaboration, we've been kindred spirits, and that there is a certain kind of, there are strong and coherent messages that are coming out of this collaboration that we hope that more and more people in the global discourse will take note of. And one of them, where I'd like to start, is number one, is the rising inequality, right? That technology is not an equalizer, and that we know that technology is having a differential impact on different people. As Ramiro said, there's different futures of work for different parts of society. And so we know that technology is having this kind of differential impact. Now, the question is, and this finding that technology is exacerbating and has the potential to continue to exacerbate inequalities, is fundamental to the growth trajectories that countries take on. We know from studies done by various institutions, including the IMF, that rising inequality is bad for economic growth, and it's clearly bad for economic growth for a variety of reasons, including promoting instability and so on. So the big policy recommendation is how do you actually prevent this kind of exacerbation of inequality? And here I'm just picking up on what my fellow panelists have said, which is Théophile mentioned closing the digital divide. Absolutely, right? And closing the digital divide means actually first acknowledging that, just having access to a cell phone doesn't give you the same utility and leverage that someone with a laptop that can sit and do remote work has, right? Like the pandemic is inducing all kinds of restructuring of work, introducing remote work. The people that cannot participate will be left behind. And it's not just because they don't have, you know, like we can't just say that just because they have a cell phone, oh, developing country mobile penetration is rising, internet access through mobiles is rising, and therefore people are, you know, there isn't this divide. There is still a divide, right? 3 children in a slum doing schoolwork on one smartphone is not bridging the digital divide. Even if you gave them 3 cell phones relative to another kid that has laptops, you know, not bridging the digital divide. So there's a very nuanced set of recommendations around bridging the digital divide and what that means. 1B would be what Ramiro kind of referred to, which is that, you know, in a way, technology is magnifying the asymmetries of power in many, and exacerbating the asymmetries of power in many ways, right? Whether it's the rich and the poor, whether it's technology companies and others, whether it's data ownership through technology companies, whether it's companies in general that have access to data and technology in ways that workers don't, and you know, and they're controlling the utilization of certain technological tools on part of their workers. There's a lot of ways that technological advancement is also exacerbating asymmetries of power that then leave many workers voiceless, right? Unionization now is not what it used to be, because workers, like 50% of the, just under 50% of the workforce in India is self-employed workers, right? How do you collectivize gig workers? Unionization, collectivization of workers is extremely important to checking the asymmetries of power that are being exacerbated in today's society. And we need to have a serious think about how to protect and empower workers in order to check these asymmetries of power. And what policymakers need to understand is that inequality is bad for growth. It's good for no one, right? So how do we check those? So one is, you know, empowering workers, making sure that they have, all workers have access to collective bargaining, freedom of association, unionizing, the ability to unionize in whatever form that looks like, even for self-employed workers, whatever collectivization looks like for them. And then the third piece of this is, of course, protecting workers through building social security systems. So as I already mentioned, with a growing sort of gig economy and the fact that increasing numbers of workers are entering self-employment, there is a delinking of employment and social security happening, right? We used to rely on employers to give their workers these welfare benefits, or the employers were the conduits, or the point at which workers were getting these benefits, pensions, health, etc. Now we're delinking the provision of these benefits because more and more workers are becoming self-employed and in the gig economy, for example, which means that who provides the Social Security? In my view, it has to be the government. And when we're talking about very heterogeneous societies, government needs to step in and basically explore iterative approaches to expanding safety nets for all workers and not specific groups of workers. Not, okay, we're going to do this for gig workers and this for construction workers and this for migrant workers, and you know, because there's too much movement of workers and it's too heterogeneous. We need to have broad social security safety nets that are built in an iterative way. And there are financing models, right? More and more countries are actually exploring these models. And we can have a whole separate discussion on this issue about how developing countries can finance expansion of social safety nets for increasingly more and more workers. And then the last thing I'll say is just picking up on what Theo had said, which was about skills training. I absolutely agree with you that, you know, I love that you said that given this sort of demographic change, we call it skills training, but it's so much more than that. It is, requisite levels of education that start with early education, that include basic academic education in addition to vocational training, right? And the fact that skill systems have to be aligned with market demand. We can't just go out and skill a bunch of young children, youth, and then hope that they get jobs, but actually the market doesn't have enough jobs, or the skills training isn't aligned with market demand. A lot of this we see in developing countries across the region in Asia, but also in other parts of the world. So when we talk about skills, it's not just about let's do digital skills. It can't be that. It has to be basic education, good quality basic education, literacy, plus vocational training, plus digital skills, plus life skills and soft skills, right? And we have to think about this comprehensively, and we have to take a lifelong approach to these. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabina, for sharing your vision on this. Ramiro, you had a couple of reactions to the other panelists' recommendations.
Yes, I think that I really enjoy talking to you and our collaboration, because we all are always learning, So I really like that. But what I'm saying is that about gender, I think that we cannot, we need to think about a complex families of technologies, each one with its own impact in terms of gender, for example. For example, automation in big factories, are hurting male workers mainly in big industries, right? For example, in Mexico, in Brazil, we are seeing that. Then, for example, maybe the platform economy can give some opportunity for women, but they will retain their role at home. So in each case, I think that we need to go a little granular on which technology, which labor market, and then we will see the impact. Maybe on aggregate, it can be better or worse for men and women, but that's not the right way to go. Maybe we need to go more, find some granularity in terms of in types of technology, different labor markets, different impacts. For example, I think that about gender, our main problem in Latin America is not that we are that we will have problems with these some markets where we have more women, but the low participation rates of women in every market, So maybe it's kind of a different problem. But just to comment on that, and I totally agree with the other comments. Just one minor question about that. I think that we in the Global South cannot afford some these big safety nets. I'm not sure that we have the space, the fiscal space, to go for one of these solutions that maybe can work in high-income countries. I don't know. We need to do the math. But when I did the math in the past in my region, Latin America, I was saying no, but the rich needs to just pay more taxes, for example. Well, that's not easy, in our countries. So what I'm saying is,
it's true. Yeah. I would like to just push back on that a little bit, Ramiro, because I agree that that's the conventional thinking on fiscal space, and that's of course the natural question is, well, yeah, I give everyone universal Social Security, but how do we pay for it, right? And who pays for it? And there are models. There's models of contributory models. There's models where you're not just talking about raising taxes for everyone. And in many of these countries, the individual tax bases are very small, right? India has a minuscule tax base, right? But there is an opportunity to think about what kind of corporate taxation rate will facilitate that. A reprioritization of funds. Several years ago, I did a study on looking at how the allocation of funds is what you're allocating funds to is as important as the amount that you're allocating, right? So there is some kind of reallocation. There's also this idea of looking at how do you tax, platforms,
Yeah.
I mean, essentially, there's a whole body of literature now emerging around taxing digital company, or taxing technology companies, digital companies. So
Yeah.
I think at the end of it, there's different configurations that we need to explore. And I said this won't happen overnight. It has to be iterative. So first you start with a small based on income, and then you expand, and then you expand over time. But there is now, I think, more and more precedent for this. And I think what we could do it in Latin America. We could do it in
I think we'll have to. Sorry to interrupt. I think we'll have to pick up this very interesting discussion next time.
I'm sure
it requires a lot of creativity and thinking out the box, but I'm sure it can be done as well. But thank you, all of you, for sharing your very interesting views. I think we've learned a lot about the Global South regions in the discussion of the future of work. It's been a pleasure listening to you, and see you next time. Have a good rest of your days. Thank you.
So thank you, Megan.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Oh, so we are leaving, or we can stay? No.
No, I'm sure we have to leave. Probably still live. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Bye, Theo.